Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So first up, apologies again for not putting more videos up, but I have been really sick as a parrot recently. I've had a temperature of 39 degrees and I've just been feeling awful. I am coming out of it now. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but I've had a full-on man flu. That's what I'm calling it anyway. And so I might cough momentarily at various points. This is not going to be a long video therefore, but really just to give you something to keep you guys interested in the channel and keep you going. So something came up on Facebook, I think it was yesterday actually, where someone made a comment on, I won't mention who or where, but someone made a comment on a certain Facebook page about the fact that cavalry swords weren't sharpened. Well, first of all, this is complete rubbish. They were sharpened. I think what gives some people the idea, the wrong, completely erroneous idea that this was the case, I think there are two things. Number one is that in the 19th century, as I've mentioned many times before, swords were issued or purchased. Remember, issued if you're a common soldier, for example, a cavalry trooper, or a non-commissioned officer like a corporal or a sergeant, or purchased if you're an officer, because you buy your own equipment if you're an officer back then. But they were issued or purchased blunt, and they were in Europe at least, and America. And they were, generally speaking, only sharpened when going on active service. That is, when war was declared against someone, okay? Or potentially if your regiment was posted to a region that was seen as a bit dangerous. For example, Afghanistan, okay? Or Zululand. If you were posted to one of these places, then yes, you might, regardless of whether there was war or not, you might just have your sword sharpened. But generally speaking, swords were either issued or purchased blunt and only sharpened if it was deemed that they needed to be sharpened. Why was this? This was to keep soldiers and horses safer. They found that if people went around with sharp swords the whole time, then they were very often injuring themselves and their friends, comrades, and their horses. So that was to cut down on injuries, but also to cut down on maintenance of government equipment. So for example, an issued sword, if an issued sword was, belonged to the government, belonged to the regiment, and it was sharp, then it would be constantly getting blunted the whole time, going in and out of scabbards and just general wear and tear. And so it would constantly have to be resharpened, and that's an expensive and time-consuming and logistically needless process. And the sword doesn't need to be sharp if you're not expecting to see action. So for that reason, the majority of antique swords that you find are blunt, because the majority of antique swords, just like modern army rifles or indeed basically any weapons from any period, the majority of weapons didn't see active service. So therefore the majority of antique swords are blunt. However, a significant number are sharpened because they did see active service. This is even true of things like bayonets. For example, World War I era bayonets, many are unsharpened, some are sharpened. So you can tell therefore whether they were used in World War I or whether they were just in stores or in regiments back home that never saw action. So that's the first thing to say. The other thing I think is that in some places and at some times, regiments were caught out. They saw action when they weren't necessarily expecting action, and so therefore their swords hadn't been sharpened. And this is the danger of not having a sharp sword ready, of course, is that you can't always predict when you're going to see active service. But moving on, I just wanted to give you an extract talking about the sharpening of swords and edges, which I thought you might find interesting. Now, many of you will know that my primary source for the study of the use of the sabre is John Musgrave Waite. And what I'm holding here is an original copy from 1880 of John Musgrave Waite's manual. And I obtained this quite recently actually, and it's a lovely thing. You can see it's not particularly big. But that's what it looks like. The scans on our website, there is the man himself, John Musgrave Waite, and here's his manual with lots of text and illustrations and everything else going all the way through. But he does talk briefly about edges to put on swords, and this is what he says, I quote, Various edges are put on swords, but the best and most serviceable one, in my opinion, is a short chopper edge. It is the one put on swords used for cutting bars of lead, so-called lead cutters, that I've talked about in previous videos. Cutting carcasses of sheep and legs of mutton. The bone of a leg of mutton, which is almost as hard as any substance the edge is likely to come into contact with, will not turn it. In other words, won't bend the edge. So it's hard enough to resist impacting bone. I have now swords with this edge in my possession, with which hundreds of bars of lead, numerous carcasses of sheep and legs of mutton and other substances have been cut, and the edges are still in good condition and fit for use. Now, Hutton, in his book The Cavalry Swordsman of 1867, a little bit earlier than this, 13 years earlier, actually goes into a little bit more detail, and he has a slightly differing opinion on the edge that should be on a sword, and he believes it should be very slightly serrated in the fashion that an edge would be if you apply the edge with a fine file. And the result that he says is that if you looked under a magnifying glass, what you would see is a saw edge with all of the teeth pointing downwards. And he believes that this would be the best edge, or is the best edge, for cutting through clothing and flesh. So slightly different opinions in there. And you know what? I own roughly 100 antique swords. Probably more than that actually, but I haven't counted for a while. And maybe 30 or 40 of them are service sharpened. And they all have different types of service sharpening. So there wasn't one way to do it. There isn't only one way to sharpen a sword. And even if we look at Indian tulwars or tega, various forms of Indian sword in fact, not just tulwars, if we look at the edges applied on those, again you see different types of sharpening, different angles, different fineness or degree of polish at the edge. I have personally found from test cutting that sometimes a rougher edge can cut certain materials far better than a very polished edge, for example. A razor edge, a very, very polished fine edge, doesn't necessarily always cut the best, depending on how you're cutting and what you're cutting, and the shape of the blade and the edge geometry of the sword as well. So it's a very complicated topic, and opinions abound. There is no one correct answer. But there you go, really just to say that certainly 19th century swords were indeed sharp, or they were intended to be sharp. Sometimes people messed up and either sharpened them badly, or they got blunt, or they forgot to sharpen them, or didn't have time to sharpen them. But generally speaking, they aimed to make them very sharp. And I actually have an account from the Crimean War of a gentleman who was just about to take part in a storming of the city of Sevastopol, and he describes his sword as having been sharpened to shaving sharp. So they were clearly very concerned about it. So that's the first thing to say, and the second thing to say is that there are many different types of sharpening and different types of edge you might put on a sword, partly down to personal choice and experience, partly down to the type of the sword and the edge geometry, and partly down to what it is you are hitting or aiming to cut through. And obviously some types of edge will cut better through flesh, some will cut better through bone, some will cut better through clothes, and so on. There we go, folks. Cheers. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.